All right. Um, I'm Zachary Bowman. I work here at the Samuel Dorsey Museum of Art. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Kerry Carso. Kerry is the chair and professor of art history. Excuse me, is chair and professor of art history here at SUNY New Paltz. She's the author of Follies in America, A History of Garden and Park Architecture, a wonderful, wonderful book that is partly why this exhibition that we have at the Dorsey exists. She's also the author of American Gothic Art and Architecture in the Age of Romantic Literature from the University of Wales Press in 2014, which was the winner of the 2015 Henry Russell Hitchcock Award from the Victorian Society in America. I'm so excited to hear Kerry talk about her book and her exhibition, and thank you all for joining. Kerry, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Zach. I'm so excited to be doing this. And it's a lot of it has to do with you, Zach, because you gave me the idea to do this exhibition at the Dorsey. When you heard about my book, you said maybe you could do an exhibition in the seminar room. So here we are. So thank you so much. And what I'm going to do is share my screen. So let me start that up. And I will start the slideshow. And everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, Zach? Good? All right, good. Let me just change this a little here. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much for coming. When I see the names in the list of participants, I think I know everyone who's here. So thank you so much. I see students and I see colleagues and friends from different places. So thank you so much. All right, so today I'll be talking about two things. And they're obviously very related. I'll be talking about my exhibition at the Dorsey called Follies and Picturesque Tourism, which is up through December 12th in the seminar room. And also the book that I wrote that just came out last month, Follies in America, that Zach mentioned there, from Cornell University Press. And so I've been working on this book project for a number of years, and the book has finally come out, and I'm just excited that I also have this opportunity to share some of the research in this exhibition. So welcome. If you look at these two images, you see the cover of the book has a building on it, and that will be a building we'll talk about, and that's in Cooperstown, New York. And that building was the inspiration for the book. But before I tell you about Kingfisher Tower, what I'm going to do is go on and do some definitions here and talk about what follies are. So looking at that list of participants, many of you already know this, but in case people aren't that familiar with follies, I show you two images here from an English landscape garden, which is called Stourhead Garden in Wiltshire, England. And what you see here on the left is this garden from the 18th century. It was designed by Henry Flitcroft, the architect, and Henry Hoare, who was the patron. He had this aristocratic estate in England, and he wanted to create a landscape that looked like a 17th century landscape painting. So that's part of where the term picturesque comes from. It means like a picture. And so it's a literal, moving of earth and damming of waters to create a scene here that looks like it could be a landscape painting. So a lot of it is artificial, but of course the picturesque as an aesthetic category is used to describe gardens and landscapes, and as well as architecture that is irregular, varied, rugged, has a sense of mystery and surprise in it. But it's highly artificial, even though it looks natural. And so another example of this, if you're familiar with Central Park took a great deal of effort to create, and much of it looks very natural, but it's man-made. And so in this case, we have a place that looks natural. This is very different from what came before the English landscape garden, which is of course the French tradition in the 17th century. A place like Versailles, Louis XIV's palace and gardens, they look obviously manicured, those gardens, and you can see the hand of man. A picturesque garden is meant to look natural. And so as you walk through this garden, there's a circuit path around this lake that you see here. And you feel like you're following your own path, even though, of course, the landscape designer is leading you through that landscape. You feel like you're exploring, and there's a sense of mystery and suspense as you come upon these little buildings. The little buildings are known as follies. So follies are so called because when common people saw that aristocrats, these rich people, were building these ostensibly useless buildings that are not meant as residences, they don't have some higher purpose, they are merely landscape ornaments. Regular people looked at them and said, that's kind of foolish. Why would you spend money building these silly little buildings? And so I've been fascinated with follies for a long time, ever since I first started studying architectural history in college. And I just thought they were curious and interesting. And the ones that I look at in my book, they're all historicized, meaning they recall past times. And so when you look at this image, this photograph on the left at Stourhead, you see that little building. It's a recreation, a miniature replica of the Roman Pantheon. And so when you see it, you might think, what's there a Roman Pantheon doing here? I must go investigate. And so you're drawn then towards that building. And as you get there, you might look out, it's also a belvedere. So you're looking out onto the landscape and you see yet another little building and you're drawn to that one. So in other words, you're being drawn through the landscape on a prescribed path by the landscape designer, but you feel like you're just kind of exploring. So follies are fun. Follies can be very idiosyncratic. They can be eccentric. And so I had a great deal of fun working on this project, asking the question, are there any follies in America? I show you here also on the right, I just want to show you King Alfred's Tower. One of the big themes that I investigate in my book is American nationalism, but follies can represent all kinds of different stories and narratives, including nationalism, even in English landscape ornaments. And so King Alfred's Tower, designed by Henry Flitcroft, is not in the circuit path at Stourhead. It's about a mile or two away, but it is named after King Alfred, who was an Anglo-Saxon king. And so what the owner of the estate is doing is tracing their own lineage back to Anglo-Saxon times. So it's a way to promote his family history, as well as English nationalism, because this is an important Anglo-Saxon king. And of course, King Alfred's Tower is also a belvedere. So when you go inside that building, you climb up a staircase. And when you get to the top, you have this magnificent view. So we'll be looking today at towers as one of the types of follies that you'll see in America. All right, so I had studied this in college. And then in 1999, I moved to the Cooperstown area. And when I arrived in Cooperstown, I saw Otsego Lake. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. And I saw this little building that was on the side of the lake. And I found out it was called Kingfisher Tower. And I thought to myself, that's a folly. That is absolutely a miniature pseudo-medieval castle that looks a lot like King Alfred's Tower, these other towers that you see in these English landscape gardens. What is it doing here? And that is what launched my project many years ago. When I lived in that area, I started to investigate Kingfisher Tower, and I wondered, are there other towers like Kingfisher? Are there other follies in America? Because when you think about American architecture, and you think about the founding, and my book covers 1776 to 1876. And so in looking at that first 100 years of the United States history, you think about the founding principles, you think about the idea of the democratic republic, you think about Greek and Roman architecture, and all those kinds of ideas. And you also think about how Americans wanted to be different from Europeans. We think about America not being that kind of aristocratic, necessarily aristocratic place like England. And so how could there be follies here? And so that was an interesting question to investigate. And what I found was, there's no Stourhead or Stowe, nothing on that scale in the United States, but there are certainly plenty of examples of follies. And so this building kind of took me along this path to investigate what is a very understudied building type, especially in American architectural history. There really have been no serious studies of follies before my book. And so it was wide open, and it was great to be able to do this work. So to tell you about Kingfisher Tower, it was built in 1876, designed by Henry Hardenberg. And you might know him as the architect of the Dakota Building and the Plaza Hotel in New York City. But he also designed this little building, less known, I think, unless you're someone who lives in Cooperstown. But Hardenberg was designing for Edward Clark. Edward Clark was a key figure in the success of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, along with Isaac Singer. And so he made a fortune in both real estate and in sewing machines. And he had this tower built in Cooperstown, which is where his wife was from. And immediately locals started calling it Clark's Folly. You know, the idea being, why is this rich guy building this little building along the shore of Otsego Lake? And so Clark actually went so far as to write a justification for the news, and he published in the local newspaper to explain why he did this. And he explained that he was trying to beautify the lake. And he's also bringing, of course, this idea of historicized architecture. So he's taking a natural American landscape and inserting an object that represents or signifies European culture. And so it's curious, it's 1876 when he's doing this. And of course, a 19th century American architecture is full of imported styles from Europe. So that is not surprising. But it is interesting that he chooses to build a folly. And so this building has no other purpose other than to ornament the landscape and to provide a view. So it is indeed a belvedere. And I should mention too that the image on the left here is a postcard that's in the exhibition. So I'll be mentioning when there are things that are in the exhibition, objects that you can see when you go to the Dorsey Museum. On the right is a photograph that I took. And by the way, this building is still owned by the Clark family and it is not open to the public. So your best chance to get a nice view of it is to take a boat ride on Otsego Lake, where you can take a picture like the one you see on the right, which I took a couple of years ago. All right, so the first chapter of my book, I lay out the English tradition of the landscape garden to then understand how it becomes imported to America in this first chapter. So what you're looking at here on the left is a page from a book about Stowe Garden, which is another famous landscape garden along with Stourhead in England. And this particular book was owned by Thomas Jefferson. So when you look at the book and this page here, and this is illustrated in my book, Follies in America, you see all the different kinds of buildings that might appear in an English landscape garden. So you've got an arch, you've got a ruin, you've got a temple, you've got a shell bridge. And so Jefferson was looking at this book. He also went to England in 1786 and made a tour of English landscape gardens with John Adams. And they recorded their impressions of these gardens in 1786. Now, you imagine Jefferson was very interested in doing this tour because he had already started at that time to work on his own garden at Monticello. So the two images that you see on the right here relate to Monticello, which means little mountain. And it is Jefferson's plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia. So throughout many decades, Jefferson used his garden as a sort of laboratory of architecture. And he was trying out different kinds of buildings that he might like to add to his garden there. And only one of them was ever executed. So there are about 20 different designs that Jefferson made, but most of them only ever remained on paper, like the one you see in the middle. The one on the right is the only one that was ever constructed. And what you see here in this photograph is a recreation that was made, I think in the 1980s, of what it may have looked like. So it's a little Neo-Palladian structure on the edge of the vegetable garden with a view of the vineyard below. And Jefferson used this building for reading and relaxing. In the middle, though, is a very interesting building, thinking about belvederes, because in the middle, we have a tower that Jefferson designed on paper for Montalto, which is the high mountain that overlooks Monticello. So this building is really curious because it's in a kind of neo-medieval style, although it's also very rational and geometric. So it's a series of cubes, one on top of the other. And then at the very top, you see some battlements, like you might see in a medieval castle, a defensive feature. And so it's very unusual and curious and very early for any kind of medieval revival in the United States. This building was designed sometime around 1776. So just as he's writing the Declaration of Independence around that time, he's designing this, and this is one of several towers that he designed for Montalto. So I've been very interested in this building because it was meant to be, a folly. It would have been visible from, for instance, the dome room at Monticello, but it also would have been a tower that you could climb, and it would have been of an enormous scale, according to the dimensions on his design here. But you could climb up it and then have a view of the mountains around Charlottesville. So Thomas Jefferson is one of the earliest Americans who is importing these ideas of the English landscape garden into the United States. And so my first chapter deals with Jefferson and others and looks at some kind of full designs of landscapes where you see follies in the late 18th and early 19th century. And then the rest of the book is laid out by building type, subcategories within the idea of the folly. And so I do have a chapter on temples. Now, each of my chapters begins with a story about Thomas Jefferson. He kind of goes throughout the book. He's such an important figure in early American landscape architecture. So in my temples book, I found this photograph at the library company in Philadelphia, and was immediately struck by it because it's so interesting to look at. It's kind of out of proportion, you could say, in terms of the architectural proportions here. But also there's an interesting story connected to it. So this photograph was made in 1870 by a photographer named Robert Newell. And what Newell was doing was creating a bunch of photographs that he planned to circulate at the Philadelphia Centennial. So that took place in 1876 as a way to commemorate the first 100 years of United States history. And so it's known as the Philadelphia Centennial. It was a World's Fair. And so this building is, taking on some prominence then, as you can imagine, in 1876. And also what Newell then said about the building was, that, and this was a legend that was circulating at the time, was that this building was important historically because on July 8th, 1776, according to the legend, Thomas Jefferson read the Declaration of Independence to a crowd of admirers. And so that's huge. Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence. The notion that he was outside of Philadelphia at this summer house reading it, it's probably not true. But what's interesting about these follies is that I found that a lot of them had these narratives attached to them that participate in a kind of myth making in the early United States. And so they become this kind of locus of commemoration and myth making. And so that made these follies, even though they seem small and insignificant, and in fact, this building does not survive to the present time, they actually can tell us a lot about 19th century American culture. So that really drew me in to this idea that follies can, again, connect with nationalism and these American stories. So when you look at the building too, I wanted to just point out that, I'm calling it here a temple. It's a neoclassical building, it has columns, but it doesn't look like any Roman or Greek temple that you might find from ancient times. So it's kind of a strange adaptation, but it does relate to Monticello. So if you look here at Monticello, you can see that it also has these gleaming white columns, and it also has, you can see here, some chinoiserie, which this, ridiculously oversized balustrade here is also in this, this style known as chinoiserie, which is a Chinese influenced style in decorative arts and architecture from the 18th and 19th centuries. And so there's lots of kind of interesting connections going on with this little building outside of Philadelphia. And from there, I move on to summer houses. Summer houses today we would call gazebos. In the 19th century, I did not find any evidence that people called them gazebos. Summer house was definitely the term. Also pavilion was another term that was used. And in particular, I look at what we know as rustic summer houses. So rustic means that the design of the building comes from nature. So it's made out of natural materials, often using tree trunks and bark and things like that, so that it blends in seamlessly with nature. Now, summer houses became popular, of course, because in the 19th century, especially among the middle class, there was a desire to escape from the city because of rapid industrialization and urbanization. And these summer houses were a sort of antidote to what was going on in a country that was rapidly changing because of the Industrial Revolution. So you see these little buildings often in tourist locations. So here are two images from the exhibition at the Doorsky. On the left is an image of Lake George. This is a chromolithograph. And you see here that there is a little summer house there, ensconced in nature. And according to one author, it was just big enough for a lazy hermit to get into. And so you would row out in a canoe or a rowboat out to this little island. It was called Tea Island. And there are tourist accounts and books and so on about this experience. And so in this case, this summer house is a place, again, to ornament the landscape, but also to blend in and to provide a place for vacationing and resting. Another place where you'll see a proliferation of summer houses is none other than our local gem, which is the Mohonk Mountain House. So what you see on the right is a promotional pamphlet that's in the exhibition about Mohonk from the late 19th century. And so if any of you have been to Mohonk, I am sure you have seen the numerous summer houses. Here's a photograph of one of them that dot the landscape there. These were all constructed originally in the 19th century, and then rebuilt over the years. These are made of natural materials that would not survive 100 years. So when you see these summer houses, they are not original. However, when they rebuild them at Mohonk, they build them in the same locations where the earlier ones had been, and they try to follow the design of the building on that particular site. So it's a kind of a continuation. And so here you can see some of the summer houses that are at Mohonk, and they are all throughout the acreage there along those carriage roads. And at one point at the turn of the century, they cataloged them, and there were about 117, I think, summer houses at Mohonk. So they're everywhere. It's like a gazebo junkie's heaven. And so that's one of the reasons I love Mohonk. And so here in this photograph, you can also see Skytop Tower. I'm not going to talk about Skytop today, but that is from the 20th century, and it is in my book. I talk a little bit about what happens after 1876, and so I include Skytop, which is actually a 20th century folly, but that overlooks the campus of SUNY New Paltz, and you can see it from campus, but that is part of Mohonk Mountain House. All right, and then from summer houses, I move on to towers. And so these are prospect towers, also known as lookouts, observatories. These are different terms used in the 19th century. One of the key ones is, of course, the Belvedere Castle, which is in Central Park. The Belvedere, and this is a postcard that's in the exhibition, was built or designed in the late 1860s and then completed in 1871 by Calvert Vaux. You might know Vaux, of course, was the co-designer of Central Park. And so he designed this folly as a prospect tower, an observation site. And so when you go to the Belvedere, which is still open to the public today, of course, there's a series of terraces that you can occupy, each of them giving a slightly different view of the surrounding landscape. And so the Belvedere Castle is very much a folly. It's very much in the tradition. And of course, Central Park itself is along the lines of an English landscape garden. It has picturesque parts to it, but it also, of course, has some formal passages. But in this case, this is overlooking the Ramble. This is the most picturesque part of Central Park. And so it very much fits in with the idea of the folly. And it's in the Romanesque revival style. So, like Kingfisher Tower, it looks like a little medieval castle. Now, I should mention, too, Terrapin Tower, which is on the right-hand side of the screen here. Terrapin Tower was built along the edge of Niagara Falls. And this is a beautiful oil painting by John Frederick Kensett that is loaned to the museum for this exhibition by my colleague, Professor Rhodes. And it's a lovely painting showing really in prominence here this building, which no longer exists. So it was built in 1833, and then it was demolished in 1873. So it existed for about 40 years. And during that time, it was a major tourist attraction at Niagara Falls. Now, the theme of my exhibition is about tourism, so I'll be talking more about that. But a lot of times these buildings accentuate picturesque, or in the case of Niagara Falls, what we call sublime scenery, by framing the view. So when you go to, for instance, Belvedere Castle and you're on these terraces, what Calvert Vaux is doing is showing you where to stand to get the best view. And that's what gazebos and summer houses do. And that's what's happening at Mohonk too. When they were building those, the Smiley brothers, when they were building those summer houses at Mohonk, it was very much to then clear the foliage around them so that you would have a view of the mountain house or the Shawangum Mountains, or in the distance, the Catskills. So Terrapin Tower was meant to allow tourists to get up even higher. And so the falls become even more spectacular. And apparently it was quite an adventure. I went back and read a diary of somebody who went to Terrapin Tower. It's at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. And he described it as quite thrilling because as you had to go out on this bridge, which you can see here, and then you could climb up into the tower. And as you're standing there, the water is rushing below you and the tower would actually tremble. So if you can imagine what that was like, this feeling of potentially being swept away. Some ladies were afraid to go onto the bridge and up into the tower. It was written about so much, I can't tell you how much information there is about Terrapin Tower. It's probably the most information for a building that nobody knows anything about. Because it was described endlessly, and it appears a lot in prints and stereographs of the era, as well as landscape paintings, including, if you know Frederick Church, the Hudson River School artist, in his famous painting Niagara. If you look closely, you can see Terrapin Tower off in the distance. So Terrapin Tower, another example of a folly. And I wanted to mention that, just to think about this, and again, how these buildings then enter the visual culture of the period. Of course, we have paintings, but I also mentioned stereographs. And so here you can see a stereograph that's in the exhibition, where you can have a closer look at the building. And what you might notice, and might be a little surprising to you, and this is again why I love Follies, because they're full of all these unexpected little surprises, and they tell little stories once you take the time to uncover them. And so it's a lighthouse. And so you have to say to yourself, what's up with that? This is not a navigable river at this particular point. You would not want to be in a boat about to go over the falls. So why is it a lighthouse? And so what I discovered in doing my research is that in this period of the 1830s, when Terrapin Tower was first built, it was a time when the United States government was building lighthouses up and down the East Coast to have a system of warning for mariners. And this was already well established in Europe. And so the Americans were a little behind in doing this. And so by building lighthouses, they were kind of, it was something that's related to nationalism. It was boosting the United States in the world. And so why would you build this lighthouse here? Well, think about Niagara Falls was a symbol of American nationalism. Once the Erie Canal opened in 1825, Western New York became accessible to tourists and people flocked there. I mean, I think it was the #1 tourist attraction at this time. And so when you went there, you were in awe of this untamed American landscape, which then, of course, this is what the Hudson River School artists are tapping into, these landscape painters, into this idea that the American scenery is unique, that it's different from European scenery. And that was a point of pride for Americans. Another thing that's going on, I'll just go back a slide here with Belvedere Castle and with Terrapin Tower, is what the historian David Schuyler has called the democratization of culture. And by that, we're talking about the idea that these buildings, these follies, start off appearing in aristocratic English landscape gardens. But by the mid-19th century, the Follies become accessible to a wider American public, especially at a place like Central Park. Central Park, as you may know, was designed by Olmsted and Vaux, and Olmsted was very interested in creating a place where the social classes could come together. He had an eye towards making sure that working class and recent immigrants could kind of climb the social ladder and become genteel and learn how to promenade and things like that. And so that was how he meant for the park to be used. And so Belvedere Castle is an important place for that reason, because the view becomes accessible with this folly. The same thing's happening at Terrapin. You know, this idea that when you are elevated, you are powerful. It allows you to see further. And so giving that view or allowing that view to be accessible to more people was certainly an important part of the story of these follies, you know, as the century progresses in the 19th century in the United States. And then my last chapter before my conclusion is about ruins. And here's another place you say, ruins. Were there actually purpose-built ruins in America? In English landscape gardens, of course, they did build fake ruins, otherwise known as sham ruins. So if you were an aristocrat in England and you had a property that went back centuries in your family, and you happen to have a medieval chapel there on the property, you might ask your landscape gardener to frame the view along a path in your garden to suggest, you know, the aged quality of your family. But if you didn't happen to have that old ruined medieval building, you would hire an architect to build one for you. So it seems a little ridiculous in a way to us, but again, this is why I love Follies. But people would actually hire someone to build a purpose-built ruin. So when you look at America, you say, well, would we have such a thing? That sounds insane. And I didn't find a whole lot of purpose-built ruins. Part of the problem is they don't usually survive until the present time because they're built as ruins. But I did find a whole bunch, and so they're in the chapter. And I'm just going to show you one here. This is called the Rock Tower, little known building, I think, which was constructed in the mid-19th century in a cemetery outside of Boston in Everett, Massachusetts. And the cemetery, Woodlawn Cemetery, in the corner of the cemetery, they built this tower, and it's a belvedere. It had a spiral walk that you would go up, and this is a rural cemetery. So this is not uncommon to have follies. Rural cemeteries in America were based on the picturesque and the English landscape garden. So they're irregular, and they have, Mount Auburn Cemetery is a good example. And there are many others. Anyway, so you'd walk up this spiral path, and then when you got to the top, you would then be rewarded with a view of the ocean and the surrounding rolling hillside. Now, this tower is also what you'd call a rock work. Rock work is where you have a collection of boulders or rocks that a gardener has carefully designed and put together, and then interspersed with clinging vines and other plant life that would make it look old. And this was really a trick when you're building a purpose-built ruin, is to try to make it look like it's ancient or medieval. And so that was a great work of art according to 18th century picturesque notions. Now, this rock tower sadly does not survive. It crumbled, and in the early 1990s, it was finally carted away. But it's one that I'm very familiar with because I grew up, just down the street from this rock tower. And I always wondered, what is that weird pile of rocks in the edge of the cemetery? Years later, I found out what it was, and there it is. And then I'm also showing you another building, which was known in the 19th century as the Newport Ruin, otherwise known as the Old Stone Mill, which is in Toro Park in Newport, Rhode Island. And this is not a purpose-built ruin at all. But in my book, in addition to the purpose-built ruins, I also talk about ruins that became tourist attractions, and they become a kind of backdrop for gentility and the idea of the promenade. And so what you have here are some figures promenading in the morning here at this ruin. Now, this is another fascinating story. This is probably built in the colonial era. That is the most likely thing. It might have been the base of a windmill. However, in the 19th century, a lot of people believed that it was a building left behind by the Vikings. So, according to this theory, the Vikings came to the New World before Christopher Columbus. And in this case, this idea was perpetuated by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, as well as James Fenimore Cooper. Cooper talks about the Newport ruin in his book, The Red Rover. Longfellow wrote a poem called The Skeleton in Armor, published in 1841. And in this narrative poem, he describes this Norseman in the 12th century who has this woman he wants to marry, and her parents don't approve. And so he takes her and brings her to what becomes Rhode Island, and he builds this tower for them to live in, and they live happily until she dies. And then he buries her in the tower, and then goes off to a quite distant place and falls on his spear and dies. So Longfellow made this whole story up, but he was inspired by a skeleton that was found in Fall River, Massachusetts, not too far from Newport. And it was a skeleton with a breastplate of armor. And so it was, in actuality, a Native American a skeleton. However, he decides, I'm going to make up a story. He totally admits in his private writings that he's completely made the story up. But it becomes extremely popular, and people start flocking to this Newport ruin in order to do that romantic thing that people did in the 19th century, which is to think about the passage of time, to think about romantic poetry, and of course, to participate in this genteel activity of promenading. And then lastly, in the book, I have a chapter in the conclusion where I look at Kingfisher Tower very closely, but I also look at other follies. So there could be a whole new book that I could write that would cover from 1876 to the present, because there are perhaps even more follies, especially during the Gilded Age, loads and loads of follies. But I just look at a few of them, especially those that are, historicized, which of course is what kind of makes, I think, a building a folly. And in this case, I just show you one of my favorites from that research, which is this tower, which is located at, it's called the Watchtower at Desert View, and it is located at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. This was built in the 1930s by the architect Mary Elizabeth Jane Coulter. And she was inspired by the architecture of the Puebloans, so the ancestral Puebloans. And so places like Mesa Verde and Hovenweep. And so she built a tower that was similar to the kinds of ruins that you would find in those places. But the kicker here is that it actually has an interior metal skeleton. So it's a modern building, but it looks like a ruin. And today it serves as a tourist attraction where you can climb up and get a view of the Grand Canyon. So this is certainly a folly in the wonderful sense of that word. Now, in the last few minutes here before we have questions, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the exhibition. So what you've seen so far is some of the objects in the exhibition and how they relate to some of the themes I'm looking at in the book. In the exhibition, I have a number of different types of objects. I have some oil paintings, postcards, stereographs. We have here a pencil drawing in the upper right corner. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. And also books. And I'm going to end with books today to talk about the importance of books in folly design. So in this particular exhibition, as Zach noted, this is about picturesque tourism in New York State. So I kind of narrow things down to just New York State and just looking at tourism among the middle class, which was very much on the rise in this era. So one of the key figures, of course, in the popularization of the picturesque is Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole is a so-called founder of the Hudson River School of American Landscape Painting. And we are very fortunate at the Dorsky to have one of his sketchbooks in the collection. And so it is open here to the first page in which he writes a poem, a message to his book. But what he would do is take these small sketchbooks, of which there are several others in the world. And he would take them with him and actually do sketches that he could then use as source material for his oil paintings that he would complete in the studio. And so he would take notes and also draw pictures in these sketchbooks. And so, of course, for a landscape painter, painting during the era of picturesque tourism, he's doing a couple of things here. Number one, he's trying to find the best vantage point, which is a big deal, whether it's for you're a professional artist or you're a middle-class lady who's taking your sketchbook with you, which was a very popular activity. You are going to be trying to find the best vantage point. And that's where tourist guides come in handy, because they will have prints, pictures in the book that show you, hey, you want to get the best view of this river and this valley, go to this particular spot, and that is the best view. And oftentimes that's where a gazebo of some kind would then crop up, because that's the whole idea. Those buildings, those little summer houses, point you to the best view. So he's doing that with his sketchbook here. He's noting down the best vantage points, and then he's also popularizing this idea of going out into nature and looking at nature. And so a place like Catterskill Falls, which is one of Thomas Cole's early paintings, becomes a popular tourist attraction, in part due to Thomas Cole and his popularity. So they're kind of, I guess, tourism and the Hudson River School are kind of feeding off of one another in this period. And so here's a nice drawing that Professor Rhodes loaned to us by Edmund Burkhead Bensel, of a woman seated, and she might be at Catterskill Falls in the Catskills, but Bill has also mentioned it could be the Poconos. She's at a waterfall, and I know you can't see it well in my reproduction here, but there are some people back here and they're stepping over some water. So the idea is that this very well-dressed lady has found her way to this waterfall because of the transportation revolution that's going on in the 19th century. So of course, steamboats and railroads come into being in this century, and it allows people who live in more urban environments to have access to nature. So, and of course, that's what the Erie Canal does too for people who want to go out to Niagara Falls. It makes it accessible, because before 1825, Niagara Falls, to get there, you really had to go through the wilderness. But by, when Terrapin Tower was built in 1833, it is accessible, and so tourists start flocking there. And so transportation is a key part of the tourist story too. Now, Fort Ticonderoga is a place that I write about in my book as kind of like the Newport ruin. It's a place that had this historical meaning, and it was in ruins. And so people went there to go see the ruins. Of course, it's a fort that was in use during the French and Indian War, and it was captured by the Americans at the beginning of the Revolution. And so you could go there and walk in the footsteps of history. So it becomes a popular tourist destination. But I also included this print in the show by a contemporary artist named Jean-Marc Superville-Sauvac. And what Superville-Sauvac is doing here is that he takes an antique print, like this one of Fort Ticonderoga, and then he adds elements to it that he takes from abolitionist tracts and other visual culture related to abolition and slavery. And so Fort Ticonderoga was at the end of the Champlain line of the Underground Railroad. And so here you can see this figure who wasn't in the original print has been added here, this triumphant figure who has found freedom on the Underground Railroad. And so what Superville-Sauvac is doing here is that he's interrogating these picturesque prints and asking what is left out. I mean, this is really middle-class white American culture that we're talking about with these kinds of prints. What he's doing here is reminding us of what's not being talked about and what's happening simultaneously, which is, of course, these, picturesque tourism and these prints in particular are popular in the decades before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War, right when we have these important issues going on related to abolition and enslaved people escaping to the North. And so he is putting these two stories together to kind of highlight, again, the idea of absence in American history. And the last thing I want to end with is just a book illustration. I do include some books in the exhibition from the Sojourner Truth Library Special Collections, because really in the transmission and popularity of Follies, books play a huge role. And this is generally true of 19th century American architecture. So in this case, I have a book by Andrew Jackson Downing. This is a book called A Treatise on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, first published in 1841. This is from the 1853 edition from the library on campus. So Downing was a local landscape gardener from Newburgh who had a nursery in Newburgh, and he was also an author of a number of books, including pattern books that were targeted towards the middle class, who would then build these very up-to-date houses for that time in various picturesque styles, especially the Gothic Revival. So Downing is a key figure in the popularization of the picturesque in the 19th century. And so here in his treatise, you can see that he includes figure 88, this little building, which he calls a rustic prospect tower that's 3 stories in height with a thatched roof. He talks about the fanciful lattice of rustic branches, and this is very much in that rustic style. And what's very interesting is that this little, 3-story gazebo or summer house was actually built at Mohonk Mountain House. And so here you can see it in the formal garden next to the resort hotel, and it's still there today. Again, it's been reconstructed over the years, but here's a nice view of this summer house. And this is a pamphlet from about 1900. So I end with this idea that books play an important role. And we can't forget that when we're studying American architectural history in the 19th century, it's so important to look at book sources as well as other kinds of sources. And so with that, I will end with just some nice images from the exhibition. These are some postcards. This is Mark Twain's summer house. This is where Mark Twain wrote parts of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And this is a tower up in Saratoga, the Saratoga Monument, which is an obelisk, which is a building that you can climb up into. And so it is a belvedere. And so that was something new to America, where they would hollow out obelisks, which is an ancient Egyptian building type, so that they could function both as memorials or monuments, like the Washington Monument, but they also are buildings that you can climb up into and observe the view. So they are included in my book as Follies and in the exhibition. So thank you so much. And I will answer questions.
Thank you, Kerry. Always fascinating to hear you speak. So I'm going to read you questions that came in the chat in the order that they came in. You can also, if you want, read them. I can read them aloud if you prefer.
I see them here. I see an old college buddy here, Andy Aarons. Hi, Andy. He's reminded of Zach Van Berkovich's class, The Myth of America. Did I take that class? No, I did not. I did not take that class, but as someone with a degree in American Studies, I can assure you that I am familiar with my PhD in American Studies of the what's called the Myth and Symbol School, which I'm sure was one of the things. But Andy, do you want to say anything about that and how it relates?
No, it just seemed like in his class, he talked quite a bit about how America was made up of a series of myths, and he eliminated that through literature. And I thought when you were talking about how the myths of America, it was that these were the physical symbols of many of the things he was talking, or the authors in the books that he selected were talking about.
Yes, and that's true. And of course, any country at its founding is looking around for anything to create that idea of a shared identity. And so that's where myths come about, like the idea of, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Those things aren't true. They didn't actually happen, but they tell a story that is important to the culture of that period. And sometimes they are quite long lasting. And I found that's true of a lot of Follies, that they became these places where, important events happened. Another example is at George Washington's house, Mount Vernon. There was a summer house there. And in the 19th century, the historian Benson Lossing writes about how in this summer house, what was it? I think it was, let's see, George Washington, or was it Martha Washington? One of them had a dream. in which George Washington died. And there's this whole story about how the summer house plays a central role in this dream. And it turns out the summer house was not built in George Washington's lifetime. So it's impossible that George and Martha were in the summer house talking about this dream. So it's things like that you dig a little deeper and you realize, all right, I see what's happening here. He saw the summer house, Benson Lossing, when he went there in the mid-19th century, because it was built in that era. And of course, Washington died in 1799, so he wasn't alive. And he saw it and he thought, this would be a great place to set this dream that, it's a made up story. So what's funny is that these summer houses often become the place where people set the stories that are part of this myth making. So that's an interesting point.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, now I see Riva has a question here. Oh, yes. So why was it removed? A lot of people often speculated at the time that it was removed because it was unsafe, because it does make sense, because people felt unsafe when they were on it from the accounts that I've read. But actually what happened was the owners, it was two brothers who owned Goat Island, which is in the middle of the falls there. And they were building another prospect tower that they didn't want it to compete with Terrapin. So they dynamited it, they blew it up and it fell into the falls. So it was a very dramatic, spectacular end to Terrapin Tower, but that's why it was taken down, not because it was unsafe.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Riva, that's a good question. And it's very, very important because that's exactly what people thought. When you look at the pictures, you think, why would anyone climb that tower? It looks a little scary, doesn't it? All right, so let's see, in the summer house on the island, I do not think that is still in existence. I've never gone to look, but those kinds of summer houses, they're made out of, again, these natural materials, and the longest they would last is about 20 years. So it would have to have been rebuilt. I read a lot of farmers' journals, agricultural journals when I was writing my book, because summer houses were popular to build on one's farm as a symbol of gentility. The idea would be, I have leisure time. It's like everybody in your neighborhood sees, oh, they must have leisure time because they have a building that they can hang out. It's like having a front porch. And before the pandemic, nobody used their front porches. And now everybody's using their porches. But it's a symbol of wealth, the summer house. And so in these farmers' periodicals, there are instructions on how to build them. And that's how I know that they would never last more than 20 years, depending on the material that they were made out of, because this was discussed in depth in these farmers' journals. So I seriously doubt that it's still there, but I've never gone to Tea Island to check it out. And then Andy asked, you grounded the history of American follies in English gardens. What were the differences between English and American follies? Well, how elaborate they are is the biggest difference, Andy. Just like in all of 19th century English architecture, when you look at the English prototypes for American buildings, they're always way more elaborate, using more expensive materials. I mean, this is just generally true of everything. I mean, this is, of course, Great Britain is an extremely wealthy empire in this time period. So the architecture is, very fine. So the American versions, I mean, something like that Thomas Jefferson building that looks like a bunch of stacked cubes. I mean, that is not great architecture. And so a lot of the buildings, there were things built like that. I found one, I did not include it in my book, but at the library company, they have a huge collection of visual culture. I mean, I'm like a kid in a candy store there. They have prints, they have photographs, and there's one of a very similar looking building that was actually constructed in a garden outside of Philadelphia. And it's the most ridiculous looking thing. I mean, it looks like some dude literally just like built something. It's not architect designed. And that's the great thing. These buildings are often vernacular. We don't know who the designer was. I find that to be charming and wonderful. But that would probably be one of the biggest differences, is just the quality in terms, if you want to be kind of high style about it. The quality is not what you would see in English follies, which are much more elaborate. Oh, did I come across any build? Oh, yes. The Hudson Valley, Steve, lots of Hudson Valley stuff in my book. Gosh, how many different examples are there? One of the places that I looked at was Springside in Poughkeepsie, which you might be familiar with, which is Matthew Vassar's estate. And that garden was designed by Downing and Vaux. before Downing tragically died, and he was partnering with Calvert Vaux at that time, who later designed Central Park with Olmsted. And so in that place, one of the most curious things I found at Springside, which is actually still there. So here's a, Steve, I know you like to go out there and look at architecture. See if you can find the remnants, this is ridiculous, of Stonehenge. So Matthew Vassar put a miniature Stonehenge on a little knoll at Springside, which was a picnic spot. And so when you go to Springside today, it's the only extant A.J. Downing landscape garden that still exists. And there's a great preservation group that has, kind of mapped it out, and they have signs up of what used to be there. And so I went there, I climbed the knoll, and the stones are still there. They're all toppled. But what Vassar had there was this little, it wasn't designed, this was after Downing's death that he put this in, but it's a little miniature Stonehenge. And if you read Benson Lossing's book about Matthew Vassar, he describes the little Stonehenge. So that is a purpose-built ruin that I found, which then launches me in the book into talking about Stonehenge and images of Stonehenge, very popular in 19th century American culture. So yeah, there are other examples too, but that one comes to mind. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm trying to figure out the wording I want to use, because you're talking in some cases of these follies as attractions, tourist attractions. Would you consider something like the Eiffel Tower in Las Vegas in the same vein? Like, I'm curious if there's something that would really be that would differentiate between that and, say, Terrapin Tower.
That's an excellent point. I don't believe you can climb the tower in Vegas. You can't, right? It's like a stage set, right?
I think you might be able to go to the top.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I know the one at Epcot is just, it's just like it's stuck out of a building. I tried to find the base of it once, and I couldn't. They wouldn't let me go that far behind outside the park and look around. So this is an interesting question, because I'm talking, so I'm so excited. I'm talking too fast. Interesting question. The Eiffel Tower itself is a prospect tower. Now, is it a folly? I like to think of follies as more historicized buildings, and that is a completely modern building, really. It's made of iron. It's the size of a skyscraper. It's enormous. It's almost as tall as the Chrysler Building. But it was built as a prospect tower, and that was its function. It was the entrance to the World's Fair in Paris. But it also, you could take an elevator, which you can still do today, and climb up to the top, or you can walk up to the top, and then it provided a view. And so it relates to follies. I do make a distinction, though, in my book, where I'm looking at things like that. Like, there was a tower, it wasn't like the Eiffel Tower, but there was a tower made of metal. There's actually more than one at the Philadelphia Centennial. And I consider those they're like predecessors to the skyscraper. And they're not really follies, because they're not historicized. And so you don't have that reverie of looking to the past that you have with these follies, which is very much part of that experience of follies. But it's related. And then to think about Las Vegas and having a tower there, that whole idea, I think of these buildings as entertainment architecture in a way. I mean, it's the architecture of leisure, follies. And so, there have been scholars who have looked at the connections between the English Landscape Garden and Disney World, which has all, Hershey Park, all these places have these fake buildings. And, Epcot is a great example of that, with all, it's a trip around the world, but you've never left Orlando. And then you go to Vegas. I mean, talk about buildings that are ridiculous. There's tons of them there. But at some point, I guess you have to draw the line, and say, well, how do you define this? Because a lot of people will talk about residences as follies because they're ridiculous, or, a building that's shaped like an elephant. Is that a folly? And I make the distinction: if it's something you can live in, if it's a residence, that's not the same thing as the tradition of the folly. But let's just say they're related, Zach. I like to think of, the fake Eiffel Tower as something that's related, and the buildings at Disney World, they're related to follies. They come out of the same tradition. I don't know if I'd particularly call them that, but how can you say they're not related, right?
I think they also can reveal that they reveal similar things about the American spirit or American sentiment.
Yes.
So it's really interesting.
Here's a question from Riva.
Yeah.
How might the new little island in New York City fit in? That's on my to-do list, Riva, to go there. But from what I've read about it, um, it's like a little picturesque garden oasis right there on the Hudson River. It seems like it's related. I don't think it has any historicized follies, but again, it's a kind of reimagining it's not really a public, it's sort of a semi-public space, I guess. And so I think there's a tradition here. And one of the things I look at in the conclusion of the book is how follies have had this resurgence. And I think Little Island relates to this. So since like the 1980s, there have been a number of exhibitions, and this is during the rise of postmodernism and architecture. And a lot of the postmodern architects are interested in anything that's a little cheeky, has a lot of humor in it. And follies kind of fit in perfectly. So there have been a number of architectural exhibitions. There was, of course, Mark Dion's exhibition, I guess 2 years ago now at Storm King Art Center about follies. There was one at Olana about follies. There are several different exhibitions in recent years. So I think follies have kind of had a resurgence, which is perfect timing for me because I've been working on follies for 20 years. So maybe that's why when I was studying architecture in college and graduate school, why I got interested in this, because there's been kind of a buzz for a while. But lucky for me, no one had written this book, about 19th century architecture, but it's still, I think, very important. And so Andy wanted to know, are there any follies being built today? And the answer to that is yes. I'm trying to think of something offhand that's a recent folly. There have been all these exhibitions, but what's a folly? Well, this is a little bit old, so it's not really today, but the documentary filmmaker Ken Burns built a replica of that little folly at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. And he put it in his apple orchard behind his house so that he would have a place to escape to. And this was when he was working. So it was a number of years ago, it must have been in the 1980s, but he needed a place to go and get away from, technology and the ringing telephone when he was working on his Thomas Jefferson documentary. So you do see, like in Architectural Digest and Architectural Review, examples of follies. And so I can't name them offhand. They're often private in people's gardens. I mean, during the pandemic, I'll tell you, someone I know wrote to me and said, hey, look what I did to the chicken coop. During the pandemic, I had all this free time and they turned it into a folly. It's all bright colors. It has a little seating inside. It has no other function. It's no longer a chicken coop. That's called adaptive reuse. And that's an excellent example of people. It's kind of DIY. You're doing it in your own backyard. You're creating follies. So I think it's still something, especially with the pandemic and people wanting to connect with nature, but also wanting to have a nicer backyard. Follies are not going anywhere.
I think of an example would be Frank Cabot's garden. He was an American gardener, and he had a beautiful garden in Canada, Quatre Vents, and there are a number of follies, architectural follies in that garden. There's a film called The Gardener. It's a documentary you can find on Netflix that essentially a tour of the garden. Those I think that were built in the last probably 30 years, 40 years also.
And there are architectural competitions. So the show at Olana, they were inspired because they found on a 19th century plan that I think it was Church's son had drawn of Olana. There was a spot where he marked and he said summer house. It was right in front of Olana. So there was probably like a rustic summer house right there. And so they took that and they went out and they had they asked contemporary architects, what would you build if you could build a summer house at Olana? So they had this exhibition of all this contemporary architecture, which was, a lot of it was really wild and something that really stands out on the landscape. It doesn't blend in at all. And then some of it was historicized. And so I was fascinated. I went to see this show. This was a few years ago. So this is, I talk about this a little bit in my book, but it was kind of perfect. Oh, and then, you know, anyway, there's lots of contemporary architects thinking about follies as well as backyard gardeners. So it's, you know, I think it's, they're not going anywhere. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kerry. If any architect is thinking of building a folly, I recommend picking a copy of Follies in America by Kerry Carso. It's a wonderful book, and I love the exhibition. It's really just, it's a fascinating look at culture in the 19th century and American culture in general, and I welcome everybody to come out and see it. I mean, if anybody else has questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise,
I'm gonna see Andy, who was my Harvard classmate, at the reunion next June. I guess it is, Andy. Bring it, and I will sign it for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you, Kerry. Congratulations on the book and the show. And have a lovely day, everybody.
Thanks for coming.